Christ of the Covenant Session 71 诸约中的基督第71讲 In our last 1 to 2 sessions, we saw the reality of the new covenant. 在过去一两讲我们看到新的约是多么的真实 especially as described in Jeremiah 31 verses 31 to 34, 特别是耶利米书31章31到34节所描述的新约。Our author tells us there are 3 observations we must make about the new covenant. 作者告诉我们关于新约要有3方面的理解。First, the new covenant is new, but at the same time continuous with the Old Testament. 新的约是新的约，但是同时和旧的约有它的连贯性的 continuity versus newness 连贯性和新性同样的要被重视。Secondly, 第二方面要做的观察或者理解 is corporateness versus individuality in the new covenant. 第二方面的理解是新的约一方面是群体性的，一方面也是个人性的。Thirdly, 第三方面internal reality versus external substance in a new covenant. 新的约有它的内在的真实性，也有它的外在的实质的。We have begun our discussion on continuity versus newness in a new covenant. 我们开始了讨论新的约与旧的约的连贯性和新的约是新的。We have seen how the author talked about the substance of covenant law. 作者告诉我们，约里面的律法是实质。God will write his law on the hearts of his people. 上帝会把他自己的律法写在他的子民的心里上的。Jeremiah 31:33. 耶利米31章33节。Secondly, 第二方面 both the old covenant and the new covenant are redemptive. 旧约和新约都是救赎的约。God was saving his people, redeeming his people in both covenants. 不论是旧的约跟新的约，神都在拯救他的子民的。And thirdly, 第三方面 the forgiveness of sin was foundational for both the old and new covenant. 无论是旧约还是新约，最基本的一件事就是罪的赦免。Therefore, there is continuity between old and new covenant. 从这3方面来看，旧约和新约是连贯的。But then the question arises, 但是有一个问题会浮现的。Why does Jeremiah emphasize forgiveness of sin as a basic element of new covenant? 为什么耶利米要强调新约里面很基本的一个因素就是罪的赦免呢？ Didn't Moses' covenant provide for forgiveness? 摩西之约岂不是已经提供了赦罪的吗？ Didn't Solomon encourage people to pray toward the temple? 所罗门岂不是吩咐人民要向圣殿祷告呢？ In what sense does the new covenant provide forgiveness of sins? 新约从什么意义上来说是把赦罪之恩赐给神的子民的呢？ Because you already have forgiveness of sin in the Old Testament. 因为旧约已经有罪的赦免了吗？ The answer to this question, 这个问题的答案是 It is exactly in the elaborateness of the Old Covenant provision that makes the New Covenant forgiveness unique. 就是因为旧的约里面那些礼仪那么的繁琐，因此新的约里面的赦罪是独特的。And here's where we stopped. 上一次我们在这里停下来的。The constant renewal of sacrifices for sins under the old covenant gave clear indication of the fact that sin actually was not removed, but only was passed over. 在旧的约里，以色列人必须不断的重新的献祭，这个就很清楚的指出，事实上罪还没有除去，罪是越过的。If the sacrifice of the Day of Atonement actually had established the person once and for all as righteous in the sight of God, why then was the ceremony repeated annually? 假如赎罪之日的献祭具体上设立一个人一次过在上帝面前成为义人的话，那为什么每年要重复这个礼仪呢？ The blood of bulls and goats inherently had no power to remove sin in the framework of God's just administration of the world. 上帝用他的公义来治理这个世界，在这个治理的制度里面，牛羊的血本身没有能力除去罪的。The provisions of the Old Covenant founded on such animal sacrifices could not effect the actual removal of transgressions. 根据这些献祭的方法，旧的约不能够实现过犯具体的除去的，这个是不能实现的。Jeremiah anticipates the day. 耶利米预期有一天要来 in which the actual shall replace the typical. 到了那天呢，实体要取代预表。Instead of having animal sacrifices just merely represent the possibility of a substitutionary death in the place of the sinner, Jeremiah sees the day in which sins actually will be forgiven, never to be remembered again. 到了那天，动物的献祭不仅仅是代表着有代替罪人赎罪的可能，不仅仅是如此。耶利米看到，到了那天呢，最具体的被赦免，永远不再纪念。The continual offering of sacrifice to remove sin not only provided a symbolical representation of the possibility of substitution, 不断的献祭，为了除罪而不断的献祭，不仅仅提供了一个替罪的一个的表征一个的外表的表征， It also inevitably functioned as a very real reminder that sins had not yet been forgiven. 它必然提醒人民罪还没有赦免的。By saying that sins will be remembered no more, Jeremiah anticipates the end of the sacrificial system of the Old Testament. 当耶利米说罪不再被纪念的时候，他就预期着旧约的献祭制度到了那天会结束的。The subject of the forgiveness of sins thus provides a significant basis for analyzing features of continuity and newness in the relation of the new covenant to the old. 所以罪的赦免这个题目呢，就给我们一个具体的根据，用来分析新和旧约之间的关系，新约和旧约的连贯性，新约是有多么的新。罪的赦免这个题目帮助我们去理解这两方面，连贯性和新的新性。The new factor of forgiveness anticipated in the new covenant is the once for all accomplishment of that forgiveness. 耶利米所期待的新约里面赦罪，从什么意义上来说是新的赦罪呢？就是赦罪一次过成就了 once for all accomplishment， 一次过的成就。Continuity is seen in the constant typological representation of the reality of forgiveness under the Old Covenant. 那么新和旧约之间的连贯性有何而见出呢？是在 旧约的制度之下不断的有预表来代表赦罪的事实。一方面，新约一次过成就了，所以呢，新约是新的。另外一方面，旧约不断的用预表来代表事实，所以新旧约是有它的连贯。In conclusion， 我们做一个结论 ：The radical newness of the new covenant receives special stress by Jeremiah's affirmation that this covenant came into effect because of Israel's nullification of the old covenant。我们的结论是，耶利米特别强调新的约彻底的是新的。怎么强调呢？耶利米宣告新的约要生效，是因为以色列废除了旧约 nullification， 废了旧约。The end of the old covenant necessitates the inauguration of the new。 旧约的结束就必须要有新约的设立。Now, some obvious difficulty appears when it is suggested that Israel is to be understood as having annulled the covenant. 当我们说以色列废除旧约的时候，就显然带来一些的难题了。How is it possible for a vassal to annul a covenant established by a suzerain? 这个臣属怎么有可能废除一个王上所设立的约呢？ Quite obviously, such an annulment must be considered in relative terms. 很明显的，所谓废除约，肯定是要从一个相对的观点角度来看。As far as the beneficent intention of the covenant is concerned, it may be annulled by the disobedience of the vassal. 从这个约里面，约主要把好处赐给臣属，从他的这个心意来看，从这个主人要赐福给臣属这个角度来看，那么臣属的不顺服呢，可以说是废除了约，就是从约的福分的角度来看。Since the primary intention of the covenant is to provide blessing for the subject of the covenantal relationship, it would appear quite appropriate to speak of an annulment of the covenant when the persistent disobedience of the vassal has the effect of making null and void. 因为约主要的目的就是要为约里面的立约的对象带来福分，所以呢，当这个臣属坚持不断的不顺服的时候，我们可以说这个约是废掉了，因为他把这个约里面的关系里面这个所应许的福分废掉了，或者说弃权了。The radical newness of the new covenant may be appreciated fully only from this perspective of the annulment of the old covenant. 我们必须从这个角度来看，就是旧的约的废除，才能够完全体会到新的约是彻底的新的。By removing Israel from the land of promise, the Lord dramatizes the end of the old covenant relationship. 主耶和华把以色列民呢从应许之地连根拔起，就很生动的说明旧的约的关系结束了。How could they be considered as God's people if the whole process of promised blessing has been reversed? To the extent that they are cast once more into the same position that they were before God summoned Abram out of Ur of the Chaldees. 他们怎么可能再被视为是上帝的子民呢？因为整个 上帝应许的赐福的过程了，完全翻转了。他们已经被驱逐到好像上帝还没有呼召亚伯拉罕离开乌尔的时候那个地位，怎么可能还算是上帝的子民呢？ An entirely new covenant history must begin. 一个完全崭新的约的历史必须从头开始。A people to be God's own must be constituted afresh. 若要有一个属神的子民，就必须重新的被设立。That is the meaning of Jeremiah's reference to a new covenant. 耶利米说新的约是新的，就是这个意思。When the parallel passages to Jeremiah 31 speak of this new covenant as being eternal in character, 那么当我们看与耶利米书第31章平衡相应的经文呢，他们说这个约是永远的约的时候呢， the concept best may be understood as referring to the irrevocable or definitive aspect of this covenant. 我们最好这样的理解，约是永远的意思就是永不会返回的 irrevocable， 还有是一次过定义性的 definitive 的意思，是指约的这两个层面。No possibility exists for an annulment of the new covenant. 新的约不会有任何的可能被废除的。It cannot fail to achieve its intended goal of heaping redemptive blessing and restoration on its participants. 约不会不把它原来的用意，不会不把救赎的福分和回转施行在约民的身上的。上帝必然会拯救，必然会把福分倾倒在他的约民身上的。Yet a proper balance must be maintained. 可是我们必须要保持平衡的。While annulment and newness are contrasted in the prophecy of Isaiah, 是的，在耶利米的先知预言里面，一方面有废除，一方面新的约是新的，但是另外一方面 it must not be forgotten that the old covenant also is characterized as an eternal covenant. 另外一方面不要忘记，圣经也称旧的约是永远的约的。While the form of the old covenant administration may pass away, 是的，旧的约施行的形式会成为过去。The substance of blessing, which it promises, remains. 可是旧约所应许的福分的实质是存留的。God's Torah will be written in the hearts of his people. 上帝会把他的律法写在他的子民的心上的。God shall redeem his people in an ultimate sense. 上帝会至终的救赎他的子民的 as it was done typologically under the old covenant. 正如在旧的约里面，上帝是用预表来说明他的救赎。The forgiveness of sins, which was foreshadowed under the old covenant, shall find consummate reality in the new. 在旧的约里面有罪得赦免的影子，到了新的约的时候，就有至终的最后的实体了。The new covenant can be understood in no other way than as a bringing to fruition of that which was anticipated under the old covenant. 我们只可能从这个角度来理解新约。新约把旧约所预期的、所等待的带到实现的阶段。Continuity as well as newness must be recognized in the relationship of the old covenant to the old. 因此，新的约与旧的约之间的关系呢，我们必须同时承认有两者的连贯性，而新的约 是新的。这里呢，我们讲完了第一方面的观察，就是 continuity versus newness， 新旧约的连贯性和新约是新的。现在我们来到我们作者要讨论的第二方面的考虑， corporateness versus individuality in the new covenant。 新的约是群体性的，也是个人性的。原著 page 286 to page 290， 是第286页到290页。Another question of significance with respect to the new covenant centers on the relation of corporateness to individuality。 另外一个与新的约有关的问题呢，是究竟群体性，约的群体性和约的个人性之间的关系是什么？ Both of these elements have their proper role in Jeremiah's prophecy。 群体性和个人性在耶利米的预言里面都扮演重要的角色的。But how do they relate to one another？ 可是他们两者之间的关系是什么呢？ It is rather tempting to set the individualistic dimension of this covenant over against a corporate concept, and to find the distinctiveness of the new covenant in this specific area。 我们可能有一种的试探，就是把新约针对个人的这个层面与群体性的概念呢对立起来，那我们就会说新的约的特点就是它是针对个人的约，旧约呢是针对群体的。One commentator speaks representatively for a large constituency of evangelical Christianity today when he says， 有一位解经家呢这样说，他可以说是代表今天很多的福音派人士的。这位是 R.K. Harrison 海利顺，他也中文也有他的新约概论的，在他的耶利米书跟耶利米哀歌的注释里面，原著的140页。In acclaiming this new form of covenant relationship, both Jeremiah and Ezekiel saw that it changed the older concept of a corporate relationship completely by substituting the individual for the nation as a whole。 耶利米和以西结当他们称赞这个新的约的形式的时候，他们看到新的约完全改变了旧的约里面的群体关系，因为新的约用个人取代了以色列全国了。 Probably the most significant contribution which Jeremiah made to religious thought was inherent in his insistence that the new covenant involved a one-to-one relationship of the Spirit。 耶利米对宗教思想最重要的贡献就是他坚持新的约是牵涉到一种灵里面的一对一的关系。 When the new covenant was inaugurated by the atoning work of Jesus Christ on Calvary， 当主耶稣基督在哥哥他山上成就了救赎大功而设立了新约的时候， this important development of personal as opposed to corporate faith and spirituality was made real for the whole of mankind。 当主耶稣这样子设立了新的约的时候呢，这个个人的信心，个人的灵命，就是有别于群体的信心呢，就为全人类成为事实了。下面呢，我们的作者会批判这种的把新约的个人性和旧约的群体性对立起来的这种的圣约神学，这个不算是我们正宗的改革中的圣约神学。我们下次继续，休息1分钟。